One of our most popular cases of 2021 was our Tower 100. This is a gorgeous mini-itx case that will work in all sorts of setups and is incredibly versatile, able to run an array of hardware inside despite its smaller footprint. However, I will admit it could be a little intimidating to build in an ITX case. G'day legends, Jono here from Thermaltake Australia, and if you're staring at your newly bought Tower 100 with no idea where to start, or if you're on the fence about grabbing one because you are unsure about how to actually build in it, then this video is for you. Today, I'm going to walk you through building in the Tower 100, from inserting your motherboard to cable management and everything in between. So without further ado, let's get stuck in. To begin, you must go back. I thought that sounded pretty cool, but feng shui aside, to actually start, you should pop the dust filter and set it aside. Go ahead and undo that twist tie so you can remove the GPU basement cover and the bag of cable ties and screws, which you'll want to use a bit later on, so don't lose them. What you're looking at now is the top hat of the Tower 100, and this is held onto the case with 5 screws, 4 larger ones and then 1 little one in the left corner. You can use a normal size Phillips head screwdriver for these 4 larger screws. If you're lucky like I am, a mysterious hand will appear from nowhere and supply you with a magnetic screw tray. But if you're not lucky, it's a great idea to grab one for yourself as it'll come in clutch. Now this little screw here is much easier to remove with a smaller head, like a number 1 Phillips head, so I do recommend you use something like that to remove this one, as you could strip the head if you use a larger size and put too much elbow grease in. With all 5 screws removed, the top hat will easily dislodge from the top of the case like so, and we can go ahead and pop it off to the side for now as well. Whilst here, the next step would be to remove the 3 tempered glass panels. This can be done by sliding the panel upwards. Just please make sure you've got a good grip on the panel, as you can easily slide them up out of the grooves and drop them. It only feels natural to remove the back panel now, and I'm not going to lie, this was a little hard to do, while still trying to give you guys a good viewing angle. So while I struggle here, you should find removing these 4 captive screws easy to do. The trick is to remove them just enough so they remain in the panel but come out of the threads on the back of the case, so you can then remove the panel and keep them in there. Now while the back panel is off, you see this hard drive cage right here? You can remove that too. To do that, remove the 2 screws holding it in place. With the screws loosened, you'll be able to pull it back slightly and then slide it up and remove it from the grooves it slots into. For this next part, flip the case over onto its back as you're about to remove these 3 thumb screws, which are done up pretty tight from the factory. This is to remove the 3 airflow panels at the base of the Tower 100. What you're now left with is a nice looking stripped down case, ready for us to do just a little more legwork to have it ready for the fun part, which is building. So go ahead and remove the twist ties holding all the front panel I/O cables down. There's 2 of them. One at the front of the case, and the other is at the back here. You should also make an attempt to untangle them and straighten them out a bit, as I recommend you go ahead and pull them through the cutout here at the back of the case. Leave a bit of slack at the top and we can come back and tighten that up later. You might be wondering what these cables are. So this large one here is a USB 3.0 header, this one is a USB-C header, and this one with all the small headers is the front panel buttons and LEDs. This last one is the HD audio cable for your front inputs. While you also have that cable, you should route it through the motherboard cutout and then hang it over the left side of the case, where your graphics card will go, as we'll need to route it there later. We can then grab the rest of those cables and route them through the bottom rubber grommet. Ideally, for cleaner routing, you should order them from your left to right, the USB 3.0 cable, USB-C, and then the front button cables. You can let them be a little slack for the time being. The next part is if you wish to replace the top stock fan. As I'll be installing a tough fan, if you want to replace the stock fan with something else, it's a good time to do it now as all the panels are off and there's nothing in the way. Go ahead and remove the 4 screws holding the fan in place. You can then remove the fan. You can also lay it on its back if you want to make things a little easier. Like I mentioned, I'm using one of our tough fans, but regardless of the model you use, take note of your fan's cable direction. I recommend you have the cable facing the back of the case, so you can easily tuck it away through the large cutout back there. The other thing to note is the airflow direction of your fan. Your airflow setup is up to you, but I do recommend the top fan to be an exhaust. You can go ahead and nip that fan back up a little bit. The idea is to leave it loose enough so you can slide it along the rails in case you need to move it for cable management later. Let's grab our ITX motherboard. I've installed the CPU already, but do note I haven't put any thermal paste on just yet. I've also installed the RAM and an M.2 SSD earlier. And you should too before installing the motherboard in the case, as it's much easier to do that when it's not in the case. Also, if you are using a tower air cooler like I am, it's a great idea to install your backplate and as much of the mounting hardware as you can, which is what I've done here with these 4 screws that are holding on the backplate. We just won't install the complete tower yet as we need to access the ports on the motherboard, and it's so much easier without a tower in the way. Due to the Tower 100's tower design, the motherboard is going to be oriented in a full 90-degree clockwise turn. So the layout for the cables like the 24 pin and the CPU 8 pin are a bit different, and that's also why we fed those cables through the grommet a little earlier. Remember that little bag of cable ties and screws from earlier? You can go ahead and open them up as we'll start by securing down the motherboard. The screws you should be looking for are these ones here. I know they're pretty small on camera, so if you open up your case manual, there's a better diagram in there for what the screws actually look like. You can go ahead and start securing your motherboard down to the case with those screws. With a standard ITX board, you'll only need 4. Next up, we'll grab our PSU cables. Most SFX PSUs are fully modular, and that really works in our favor. So open your PSU box, grab the cables out, and let's sort them. For this first part, you'll need your 4+4 pin CPU cable, and you'll also want to use your 24 pin cable here as well. I recommend installing your cables into the motherboard side first, before the PSU, as this makes it so much easier. Start with your 24 pin cable, plug that into the motherboard like so. Now grab your CPU cable, the one that can split into 4+4 pins like this, and go ahead and install that also. You'll now want to tackle the front I/O cables, starting with the power button. This is always a struggle, and even more so while trying to do it in front of a camera, but nonetheless install these as your motherboard layout calls for. On this board, the power is in the top right here. The reset is directly underneath that, and then the power LED plus and minus are on the top left, and the hard drive activity LEDs are on the bottom left. You can finish off the rest of the I/O cables with the USB-C connector and then the USB 3.0 header. These are straightforward as there's only one way they can go in. With them all plugged in, you can use this as an opportunity to prepare for some cable management. I like pulling out the slack from all of these cables from the bottom side of the motherboard and then bunching them at the top of the case for later. The last cable we can sort out right now would be the HD audio cable. You can route that audio cable through the large cutout on the left side of the motherboard and then plug it in. The next portion is optional, but recommended if you want to keep your cables back here neat and tidy, as we'll use the hard drive bracket to keep these cables tucked away. You can start by bunching up the HD audio cable like so, and then use the other cables to keep it in place under some tension. This next part requires the hard drive bracket we removed earlier, and we'll use that to keep the cables tucked between it and the motherboard, keeping cables neatly tucked away. The only cable you'll have a problem with here is the USB 3.0 connector, as the cord is thick. So I leave that on the outside and keep the others tucked under. Once it's on, snug up the screws so everything is nice and tight. It's time to install the power supply. Now I'm using a fully modular Tough Power SFX, but the great thing about the Tower 100 is that you can use a standard ATX power supply as well. So what I've done is install the included SFX to ATX bracket already, and we can mount this like a normal sized power supply, which I think applies to many people out there. Now our plan of attack here is to route the cables first, plug them in, and then mount the PSU. Let's start with a 24 pin cable. Pull it through the rubber grommet directly underneath the motherboard and feed it into the PSU chamber. This is going to take a bit of effort as the cable can be quite stiff. There we go, just a bit of effort. The CPU cable is next and much easier. Just wrap that around the cutout next to it and feed it into the PSU compartment as well. The last cable we'll need is the PCIe cable for your graphics card. It looks like a CPU cable but should have PCIe written on it. You can directly plug that into your PSU to begin with. Once it's attached, drop the PSU down into the compartment and wiggle it around to eventually slide it over to its mounting position. To make things easier, flip the case on its back so gravity does the work for you and holds the PSU in place as you use your much more slender hands than my meaty paws to plug in all of your PSU cables. Here's what that looks like when they're all plugged in. The next step would be to grab your PSU screws, which look like this. I think you can guess where we're going with this. Use 4 of them to secure your PSU to the back mounting location. This one is pretty straightforward and shouldn't give you too much trouble. CPU cooler install time. I mentioned earlier I'm using one of our Tough Air CPU coolers, so with the Tower 100 being a chimney design for airflow, you really want to pay attention to the airflow path. So the goal for me is to have air from the bottom of the case flow through the cooler and then out the top here. So looking at your fans, you can see the arrows which show you the direction. You'll also want to make sure your cables are coming out towards the motherboard so we can tuck them away easier and preferably through the cutout next to the motherboard. Bring your cooler mounting plate in and double check the fitment. Also ensure it's the correct orientation for the airflow configuration you're going for. For the Tough Air, I need to remove these 4 screws as they were just holding the backplate in place for the time being. Once they are removed, I can place the actual mounting plate on like so. Then you can take your cooler, check that it lines up, and if you're okay with it, we can thread those screws back on. I'll throw a little bit of thermal paste on the CPU now, and then completely ruin the aesthetic by squishing it with the tower cooler and securing it down in place. I can't be too specific here because everyone's cooler will be different, and it would be a bit naive of me to assume you all are using our super awesome Tough Air 510 CPU cooler. This is def's not a plug. Anyhow, as this is a dual fan cooler and my hands are thick boys, it's much easier to install the fan without the RAM. So you can remove it here if it helps you install your cooler too. Just clip your fans on, once again double checking your fan orientation lines up with the airflow path you're aiming for, and you can reinstall your RAM once that's all done. Now earlier we installed that new fan at the top and didn't do it up tight. This was so we could line it up with the tower fans later. So now that you've done that, you can nip those screws up a little tighter to secure that fan, as you don't want it sliding around on you. With that done, you can grab those fan cables and feed them through the cutout where your CPU cable is. It's up to you here, but I like to tuck them underneath the CPU cable as it looks a little neater. Included with the CPU cooler is a fan splitter, which on ITX boards is a lifesaver to be honest, as there's very few fan headers on the motherboard. Install that into your CPU fan header now while you have the space to do so, and feed that through the cable cutout where your fan cables go through as well. We've arrived at every gamer's favourite piece of hardware. This beauty that the camera is having a hard time focusing on is our graphics card, an ASUS Dual RTX 3070, and that's what we're going to install right now. The model requires two 8-pin connectors, and so before installing the GPU into the motherboard, we're going to install the two 8-pin connectors into the graphics card, as it's much easier to do that outside the case instead of inside. The one thing to note is to make sure that the HD audio cable is not blocking the PCIe slot. So brush that out of the way if you need to, and slot your GPU into the PCIe slot. The awesome part about this is we then get to hide away that HD audio cable with your awesome graphics card. It's back to the top-down view because it's time for everybody's favorite thing, cable management. Here you can be as lazy as you want or as dedicated as you'd love to be. In fact, we should have a good video about cable management with Nick, so you can watch that for some tips, but the gist of it is to use these cable tie-down points to bunch up the cables, like this fan cable. The great thing with the Tower 100 is this top hat covers everything, so as long as no cables block it from being put on, it's happy days. But before you shove cables in, make sure to come back to the case and install your fans into the fan splitter we installed earlier, and then you can begin tucking away cables. I like to start with the I/O cables at the top, and I'll use a cable tie to bunch them up and secure them up here like this. You can always feed excess cables behind the hard drive tray as well to keep it neat. I also find it easy to grab the top fan cable and make it follow the left hand side of the case with other cables, bunch them all together and cable tie those down too. My cable management is pretty basic. You could go way further. I just essentially do the minimum I need to ensure the back is neat and that the front of the case looks fantastic. So with all of that done, let's flip the case back up and just double check that the motherboard's rear I/O and GPU ports are not blocked by cables to the point they're inaccessible. The last thing we need to install is the rear fan that's included on the back panel here. Now the fan cable comes bundled up, which works in our favor, so if you just pull it out slightly, you can extend it a bit of the twist tie that it's bound in. So you can route it through the CPU cable cutout and install the back panel back on. Now it's just a matter of plugging that into a remaining motherboard fan header. I then feed the excess cable back through the cutout. It's the home stretch, people. Flip that case on its back so you can install those airflow panels back on like so. Grab those thumb screws and then tighten them up to secure the panels in place. To put the window panels back on, you'll want to stand the case up as the panels slide into a groove to secure it in place. Remember, these are side and direction specific, so make sure the mesh is towards the rear of the case, the glass to the front, and that the little hooks on the back panel are facing down. Which is why I'm having mega troubles here putting it back on, because I totally spaced out and forgot. See, much easier when it's the correct side. Obviously this panel here is the front one, so just check that the hooks are facing down and gently reinstall that to the front of your case. You can go ahead and place the top hat back on now, which shouldn't be blocked by any cables, and secure it down using the 4 larger screws. Go and find that tiny little screw that you're almost certainly lost and install that with a smaller screwdriver to finish it up. If you've actually lost it, don't fret, the 4 other screws are secure enough to keep that top on. Then grab that dust filter to finish your build off with the most satisfying click lock ever.
Well, that was a full walkthrough guide on how to build in the Tower 100. If you have any questions at all about the case, feel free to put them in the comments below and we'll answer them for you. I'm sure you got to see how terrible I am at cable management, but I'm sure you'll be much better at it. Now, if you did enjoy this video, please give us a like, and if you didn't, feel free to double tap that dislike button, to be sure you disliked. Subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We put out videos every Wednesday and Friday, but if you want to make sure not to miss any upload, remember to ding the bell. And lastly, check out either of these sick in the week Thermaltake videos on the screen right now. And with that, we'll see you in the next one.